In a climate-controlled vault beneath the University of Pennsylvania Museum, a curator places a fragment of baked clay into your hands. It weighs less than you expect, perhaps half a kilogram, yet the moment you feel its rough surface, something shifts. This isn't just ancient pottery. This is CBS 10673, excavated from the ruins of Nippur in 1896, and what's inscribed across its 6 columns of cuneiform has troubled scholars for more than a century. The tablet is broken, the upper third is missing, lost to time, or the shovel that freed it from 4,000 years of earth. But what remains tells a story that shouldn't exist. It describes in procedural detail instructions given by the god Enki to a king named Yasudra, dimensions for a boat, waterproofing techniques, supply lists, a timeline measured in days. It describes a flood that consumed the world, and it describes what came before that flood: cities, kings, organised civilization, existing in a period that coincides almost exactly with the final millennia of the last ice age. Comment where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your world, because what we're about to explore together isn't another retelling of ancient mythology. It's an investigation into what the Sumerian texts actually say the Anunnaki were doing during the Ice Age, during that catastrophic transition between a world locked in glaciation and the one we inhabit now. The tablets don't call it an Ice Age, of course. They call it the time before the flood swept over. But when you examine the timeline, the geography, the specific details preserved in clay, something remarkable emerges. The Sumerians insist their civilization did not begin after this flood. They insist it was restored. They list cities that existed before, kings who ruled before, knowledge that was preserved through the catastrophe. And every detail they provide, the length of the flood, the geographic changes, the sudden reorganization of civilization afterward, aligns with what geology tells us happened when the Ice Age ended. So set aside what you think you know about ancient myths and modern skepticism. We're going to read the tablets as the Sumerians wrote them, as records of infrastructure projects, records of labour organisation, records of crisis management during a climate catastrophe that reshaped the surface of the earth. Whether you interpret these records as mythology, encoded wisdom, or historical documentation is your choice to make. But first, we have to understand the world they describe, a world where the shorelines were different, where the Persian Gulf was dry land, where rivers flowed through valleys that now lie beneath 100 metres of seawater, a world in the final throes of an age of ice. The curator takes the tablet from your hands and returns it to its archival box, but the questions it raises remain suspended in the air between you, unanswered, waiting. When ice ruled the world, 26,000 years ago, ice sheets more than 3 kilometres thick covered Canada, Scandinavia, and much of northern Europe. This was the last glacial maximum, the deepest cold of the most recent ice age, and its effects reached far beyond the regions buried under ice. Global temperatures averaged 5 to 6 degrees Celsius cooler than today, but temperature alone doesn't capture what this meant for the landscape, the climate, the very geography of the world. The ice sheets locked away so much water that global sea levels dropped by approximately 120 to 135 metres below present levels. Entire continental shelves, submerged today, were exposed as habitable land. The Persian Gulf did not exist as a body of water. Instead, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers continued south through what is now the Gulf floor, joining into a single river that flowed through a broad valley before reaching the sea somewhere near the Strait of Hormuz. The entire basin that would later become the cradle of Sumerian civilization was, during the glacial maximum, hundreds of kilometres inland from the coast. Britain was not an island, but connected to continental Europe by a land bridge through what is now the English Channel and North Sea. Indonesia, the Philippines, and mainland Asia formed a continuous landmass called Sunderland. Japan was connected to Korea and Russia. The Bering Land Bridge linked Siberia to Alaska across a span of steppe grassland more than 1,000 kilometers wide. Humans and animals migrated across these corridors freely. The map of the world was fundamentally different. But Ice Age conditions were not static. Climate fluctuated. Between roughly 19,000 and 14,000 years ago, temperatures began to rise. The great ice sheets started their long, irregular retreat. Then, approximately 12,900 years ago, something changed. Temperatures plunged again, suddenly and dramatically. This period, lasting roughly 1,200 years, is known to geologists as the Younger Dryas, named after an Arctic wildflower whose pollen marks the return of cold conditions in sediment cores. The Younger Dryas remains one of the most abrupt climate shifts in recent geological history. In some regions, temperatures dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius within a single decade. Glaciers that had been retreating began advancing again. In the northern latitudes, forests died back and tundra returned. The causes remain debated. Theories range from the collapse of ice dams, releasing massive freshwater floods into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean currents, to possible extraterrestrial impacts fragmenting over the northern hemisphere. What matters for our purposes is what happened when it ended. Around 11,700 years ago, roughly 9,600 years before the Common Era, the Younger Dryas terminated. Not gradually, rapidly. Greenland ice cores showed temperature increases of 10 degrees Celsius or more occurring in less than a decade. The ice sheets, already weakened by millennia of warming before the Younger Dryas, collapsed catastrophically in many regions. Glacial lakes dammed behind ice walls burst free in megafloods. Meltwater poured into the oceans. Sea levels rose, not slowly. In some periods, rates exceeded 40 millimeters per year, more than 10 times faster than current rates. Coastal regions flooded. River deltas drowned. Valleys filled with seawater. The Persian Gulf, dry land during the glacial maximum, a river valley during the Younger Dryas, began filling with water from both the south as sea levels rose and the north as increased rainfall swelled the Tigris and Euphrates. Within a few thousand years, the entire basin was submerged. Communities living in these regions faced a slow-motion catastrophe. Not a single flood event, but decades and centuries of rising water, changing climate, shifting river courses. Settlements built near coastlines had to be abandoned. River valley villages found themselves on the shores of expanding lakes. Agricultural patterns, already marginal in many areas, became unreliable. Populations migrated, concentrated in regions that remained habitable. This was the context in which the earliest Mesopotamian civilizations emerged, not in a stable, unchanging landscape, but in a region still adjusting to massive geographic and climatic upheaval. The Sumerians, appearing in southern Mesopotamia by approximately 400 years ago, settled in a landscape that had been radically transformed within the memory, cultural if not individual, of human communities in the region. And their oldest texts insist that before a great flood, there were cities, there were kings, there was organized civilization. Mainstream scholarship treats this as mythology, a cultural memory of local flooding events perhaps, or symbolic narrative about cosmic order and divine justice. The reigns attributed to these antediluvian kings, stretching into tens of thousands of years, are dismissed as obviously fantastical, proof that the entire framework is literary invention rather than historical record. But what if the Sumerians were recording something else? Not day-by-day calendar time, but something more complex, a system of measurement, a framework for organising memory, a method of encoding information about a period so distant and so different that normal chronological recording failed to capture it. The Ice Age ended, sea levels rose, the geography changed, and in southern Mesopotamia, scribes began writing on clay tablets, insisting that before the waters came, their civilization already existed. We need to see those tablets, we need to read what they actually say. And we need to ask why, if this is pure mythology, the geographic details align so precisely with what the Earth itself remembers in its layers of sediment and ice. The world was different. The Sumerians knew this. They wrote it down. The question is whether we're willing to read it. The cities that shouldn't exist. The Weld Blundell Prism sits in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, a clay object roughly 20 centimetres tall, square in cross-section, inscribed on all four sides with cuneiform text. Catalogue number WB444. Dating to approximately 1800 years before the Common Era, it is the most complete version of the Sumerian King List, a chronographic document that attempts to record every king who ruled in Sumer and neighbouring regions from the mythological origins of kingship down to the compiler's own time. The King List begins with a simple declarative statement: after kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not Uruk, not Ur, not Kish, Eridu, a city whose archaeological remains show occupation stretching back to at least 400 years ago, making it one of the earliest urban centres in Mesopotamia. But according to the King List, Eridu was not just the first city to hold kingship, it was the first city, period, and it existed before the flood. The text continues with methodical precision. In Eridu, Alulim became king and ruled for 28,800 years. Then Alaugar ruled for 36,000 years. The kingship then moved to Bad-Tabira, where 3 kings ruled: Enmenluana for 43,200 years, Enmengalana for 28,800 years, and the divine Dumuzi, shepherd god, later associated with the dying and rising vegetation cycle, for 36,000 years. 5 kings in 2 cities, and already we have moved through more than 170,000 years of recorded reign lengths. The text continues. Kingship moved to Larak, where Ensipasiana ruled for 28,800 years, then to Sippar, where Enmain-Joanna ruled for 21,000 years, finally to Shuruppak, where Ubaratutu ruled for 18,600 years, 8 kings, 5 cities, 241,200 years total. Then the text delivers its pivot: the flood swept over. After that single line, the King List resumes. After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven again, the kingship was in Kish. The post-flood kings have much shorter reigns, still often measured in centuries, but within the bounds of exaggeration rather than astronomical impossibility. The narrative moves from mythological time into something closer to legendary history, and eventually into periods where we can cross-reference the names with other records and verify at least some accuracy. Mainstream scholarship has a straightforward explanation for the antediluvian section. It is mythology. The impossibly long reign lengths prove it cannot be historical. The flood is a literary device separating primordial time from historical time. The antediluvian kings are inventions, etiological figures created to give Sumerian kingship an appropriately divine and ancient pedigree. The cities listed may be real, but their designation as pre-flood centres of kingship is symbolic, not literal. This interpretation is reasonable. It accounts for the textual evidence without requiring belief in kings who ruled for millennia. It fits within established frameworks for understanding ancient mythological literature. But there are problems. First, the cities listed in the antediluvian section are real, and their archaeological records suggest they are among the oldest settlements in Mesopotamia. Eridu's temple complex shows continuous rebuilding on the same sacred spot across more than 2,000 years, with the earliest levels dating to the Ubaid period around 400 years ago. Bad-Tabira, identified with the modern site of Tel al-Madain, shows occupation from the early dynastic period. Shuruppak, identified with Tel Farah, was a major city by the mid-3rd millennium. Sippar and Larak are mentioned in multiple texts, and while Larak's precise location remains uncertain, Sippar's ruins are well documented. These are not random cities, they are not minor villages elevated to mythological importance. They are, according to archaeological evidence, genuinely ancient centres of settlement and religious activity. Second, the King List exists in multiple versions, composed at different times and in different cities, yet the antediluvian section remains remarkably consistent. Different scribes, separated by centuries, working in different political contexts, preserved the same sequence of cities and kings. If this were pure invention, we would expect more variation, different cities claiming to be first, rival traditions competing for primacy. Instead, we find agreement. Eridu is first. The flood separates before from after. Third, other Mesopotamian traditions corroborate the basic framework. The Eridu Genesis, an older Sumerian flood narrative, places Ziusudra, the flood hero, in the city of Shuruppak. The Atrahasis epic, composed in Akkadian, describes antediluvian cities receiving divine assignments. The Epic of Gilgamesh includes a flood narrative where Utnapishtim, the Babylonian Noah, is described as man of Shuruppak, son of Ubaratutu. Ubaratutu is the last antediluvian king in the King List. The traditions interlock. Fourth, the Sumerians themselves treated the antediluvian period as real. Later kings claimed descent from antediluvian rulers. Temple rituals referenced pre-flood religious practices. Scribes calculated chronologies that incorporated the antediluvian reigns into their understanding of cosmic time. This was not ancient fantasy literature filed under fiction. It was their history. So we face a puzzle. If the antediluvian section is pure mythology, why does it centre on genuinely ancient cities? Why does it remain consistent across versions? Why do other independent traditions confirm the same geographic and genealogical framework? The standard answer invokes cultural memory. Perhaps severe local floods in the 4th or early 3rd millennium BC were retroactively mythologized into a cosmic deluge, and earlier settlement patterns were reinterpreted as pre-flood. Perhaps the King List represents a later systematization of disconnected local legends. Perhaps the extreme reign lengths are symbolic, encoding something other than calendar years, astronomical cycles, ritual periods, divine attributes. These explanations preserve the mythological interpretation while accounting for the geographic accuracy and textual consistency. They are careful, scholarly, and probably correct in rejecting the literal reading, but they leave one detail unaddressed: the timing. Eridu's earliest occupation, around 400 years ago, in conventional chronology, places it in the late Ubaid period, after the Ice Age ended, after sea levels stabilised. The antediluvian cities, as we can excavate them, are post-flood in geological terms. They were built in the world that emerged after the ice melted, unless what the Sumerians meant by before the flood was not before the archaeological founding of Eridu or Bad Tibera, as we can dig them up. Unless they meant before a catastrophic inundation that occurred earlier, in the period when sea levels were rising, when the Persian Gulf was filling, when the entire geography of Lower Mesopotamia was being rewritten by water. If that's the case, then the cities named in the King List might mark the locations where civilization was re-established after a real climatic and geographic catastrophe. The antediluvian kings might be cultural memories of leadership structures, chieftains, priest-kings, community organisers who existed before the crisis. The impossibly long reign lengths might encode not individual lifespans, but dynastic periods, accumulated generational knowledge, or cyclical time measures that don't translate into solar years. And the flood would not be mythology. It would be shorthand for the most significant event in human memory: the end of the Ice Age, the rising of the seas, the drowning of coastal lands, and the forced migration and reorganisation of populations across the entire Near East. This reading is speculative. It requires accepting that oral traditions can preserve geographic and cultural information across millennia with surprising accuracy, a proposition some anthropologists support and others reject. It requires believing that the Sumerians, appearing in Mesopotamia with a already developed writing system, already complex theology, and already sophisticated urban planning, might have inherited at least some of that knowledge from earlier cultures, now largely lost to us. But it has one advantage. It takes the text seriously on their own terms. It asks not why did they invent this, but what were they trying to record. Eridu exists, Bad Tibir exists, Shuruppak exists. The Sumerians placed these cities before the flood, and after the flood, they say, kingship descended from heaven again, in the same region, speaking the same language, worshipping at the same sacred sites. Restored, not invented. Restored. We need to look more carefully at those impossibly long numbers, because beneath the surface absurdity there might be a pattern. Kings who ruled for 28,800 years, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years, 21,000 years, 18,600 years. On first encounter, these numbers collapse any attempt to read the Sumerian King List as history. No human lives 28,000 years. No dynasty rules for 40 millennia without interruption. The figures are transparently impossible, and this impossibility has led most scholars to treat the entire antediluvian section as mythological invention, a cosmic prologue with no connection to historical reality. But there is a pattern in the numbers, and once you see it, the question changes. Every single antediluvian reign length is a multiple of 3,600. Elulim's 28,800 years is 8 times 3,600. Alulgar's 36,000 years is 10 times 3,600. And Menlu Anna's 3,200 is 12 times 3,600. The pattern holds for every single king. 3,600 was called a R in Sumerian mathematical notation, a base unit in their sexagesimal counting system. The Sumerians used base 60 for mathematics, the same system we inherit in our 60 seconds per minute, 60 minutes per hour, 360 degrees in a circle. AR represented 60 squared, 60 times 60. So the antediluvian reigns are not random, they are calculated, systematic, built on a mathematical foundation. Elulim ruled 8R, Alulgar ruled 10R, and Menlu Anna ruled 12R. This raises an immediate question. Why would mythological invention bother with mathematical precision? If you're inventing fantastical kings to establish divine legitimacy, why not just say they ruled a very long time, or they ruled forever? Why construct a system of multiples? One possibility is astronomical. The number 3,600 approximates certain orbital and precessional cycles. Precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis, completes a full cycle in roughly 25,770 years. Various scholars have attempted to correlate our values with precessional ages, Babylonian zodiacal calculations, or other celestial cycles. In this reading, the antediluvian kings don't represent individual rulers, but astronomical ages, vast epochs of cosmic time during which the divine order was established. Another possibility is genealogical. The numbers might encode not single lifespans, but dynastic sequences, accumulated generations of rulers in a given city. 8R could represent 8 dynastic periods, each R corresponding to a complete cycle of rule passed through multiple generations. The specific multiple might encode information about the relative importance or duration of each dynasty's influence, preserved in a form that could be transmitted orally before the advent of writing. A third possibility is ritual or calendrical. Some cultures measure time in overlapping or nested cycles rather than linear progressions. The antediluvian reigns might represent ritual periods, cosmic cycles of renewal, or mythological time measured by divine rather than human standards. The R unit could function as symbolic rather than literal, a placeholder for a complete sacred period rather than a specific number of years. Each of these explanations has advocates in academic literature. Each preserves the scholarly consensus that the antediluvian section is not literal history, while attempting to decode what system of meaning lies behind the numbers. But there's another detail worth considering: the total. If you sum all 8 antediluvian reigns, you get 241,200 years, exactly 67R. Why does the total matter? Because the King List presents itself as a chronological record. It narrates a sequence. Kingship is in Eridu, then it moves to Bad Tibera, then to Larak, Sippar, Shurupak, then the flood, then kingship descends again. The text implies continuity, a single timeline from cosmic origins to the scribe's present. If the antediluvian section represents mythological time, epochs of divine establishment, then the flood functions as a rupture, separating primordial time from historical time. After the flood, kingship descends from heaven again, and the reigns become shorter, more plausible, eventually reaching figures that can be cross-referenced with archaeological evidence. But if that's true, why does the antediluvian chronology add up? Why does it form a coherent total rather than symbolic infinity? Mythological time shouldn't be calculable. It shouldn't sum to a specific number of R units. It should gesture toward eternity, not quantify it. Unless the numbers are trying to tell us something else. Let's consider a different framework. What if the R unit doesn't measure solar years at all, but something else? A different timescale, a different astronomical cycle, or even a conventional notation that was understood to mean something specific in antediluvian contexts. Some researchers have proposed that the antediluvian chronology might be tracking not individual human lifespans, but cultural or institutional memory across vastly long periods. 8R might mean 8 major periods of occupation or 8 cycles of rebuilding. 10R might mean 10 generations of transmitted authority. The specific multiples would encode real information, relative durations, sequences of development, patterns of cultural transmission, but translated into a notational system that doesn't map directly onto calendar years. This reading requires accepting a level of abstraction. It means the King List is not lying when it says Lulim ruled 8R, but we are misunderstanding what ruled and R meant in that context. It means the antediluvian section is historiography, an attempt to record real cultural memory, but using a framework alien to our linear, calendar-based chronology. Is this plausible, or is it special pleading, trying to rescue a historical reading by redefining terms until the text says what we want it to say? The problem is that we don't have a key. We don't have a Sumerian text that says, when we speak of antediluvian time, here is how the R system works. All we have are the numbers themselves, the geographic locations, and the narrative structure. We can observe the pattern, multiples of 3,600. We can note the consistency, the same system across multiple versions of the King List. We can recognize the intentionality. These are not random figures, but calculated values. But we cannot, with certainty, decode what they encode. What we can say is this: the Sumerians did not consider the antediluvian period to be simply mythological. They integrated it into their chronology, calculated its duration, tied it to specific cities, and linked it genealogically to later kings. They treated it as part of their history, however distant and difficult to measure by ordinary means. And they placed a boundary, the flood, a single event separating one kind of time from another, after which the counting system changes, the reign lengths shorten, and the world as we recognise it begins. If this boundary corresponds to a real event, the end of the Ice Age, the catastrophic flooding of lowland regions, the geographic transformation of Mesopotamia, then the antediluvian section is not fantasy, it is memory, distorted by time, encoded in unfamiliar notation, but memory nonetheless. Memory of what? Of cities, of kings, of organised civilization existing in the world before the waters rose. The Sumerians insist this civilization did not emerge spontaneously after the flood, it was restored, which implies it existed before, which implies infrastructure, labour organisation, knowledge systems, social hierarchies, all the apparatus of civilization were already in place. And if we want to understand what that apparatus looked like, we need to turn to a text that describes it in shocking detail. A text about labour disputes, infrastructure projects, and divine bureaucracy. A text that opens with a statement that should make us pause when the gods had to work like humans. The Atrahasis epic, and the rebellion that created us. The labour strike that changed everything. The Atrahasis epic survives in fragments, clay tablets excavated from multiple sites, dating to the old Babylonian period around 1800 years before the Common Era, though the story itself is clearly older. The best preserved version comes from a tablet in the British Museum, catalogue number BM 78941, inscribed during the reign of Ammi-Saduqa, great-grandson of Hammurabi. Other fragments from Sippar, Nineveh, and Ugarit fill in gaps, allowing reconstruction of most of the narrative. The text opens not with creation, but with labour, a division of responsibilities among the gods. The Anunnaki, the senior gods associated with heaven and the upper sphere, and the Igigi, the lesser gods associated with earth and the sphere below, have organised themselves into a functional hierarchy. Enlil, leader of the Divine Council, holds the Tablet of Destinies and directs the cosmic order. Anu rules the heavens. Ea, also called Enki, commands the freshwater depths, the Abzu, and the Igigi are assigned the work. What work? The text is specific. The Igigi must dig out the beds of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They must excavate irrigation canals. They must construct watercourses to transform the arid Mesopotamian plain into agricultural land. This is not symbolic labour. This is hydraulic engineering on a massive scale, the foundational infrastructure project upon which all Mesopotamian civilization depends. The text says they worked for 40 years. 40 years of digging, 40 years of hauling earth, 40 years of back-breaking labour in the sun. And then, at night, they surrounded Enlil's dwelling and refused to continue. Every single one of us gods has declared war. We have put a stop to the digging. The load is excessive, it is killing us. This is not cosmic mythology about abstract divine will. This is a labour dispute, a strike. The Igigi, gods assigned to the worst work, receiving the least recognition, bearing the physical burden, while the Anunnaki, supervised from above, have organised themselves and demanded change. Enlil is furious. He summons Anu and Ea for an emergency council. Nusku, Enlil's minister, goes out to negotiate with the rebels, but the Igigi refuse to back down. They have burned their tools. They have abandoned the work sites. The irrigation project, the infrastructure upon which divine civilization depends, has stopped. Enlil's first impulse is to identify the ringleader and punish him. Who is it who started the war? Who is it who began the conflict? But the Igigi respond collectively. Every single one of us gods has declared war. There is no single leader to punish. This is systemic revolt. At this point, the text introduces a solution proposed by Ea. If the Igigi will not work, and if violent suppression would destroy the labour force entirely, then a substitute must be created. A new being, something strong enough to perform the labour, obedient enough to be controlled, numerous enough to replace the Igigi across all work sites. Humans. The text describes the creation process in unsettling detail. Ea and the birth goddess Mami require raw materials. They choose a god, one of the Igigi who has personality, one who has been particularly vocal in the rebellion. The text names him as Geshtu-E, ear, the one who listened for wisdom. They slaughter him. His blood is mixed with clay. The mixture is formed into human shape. Mami speaks, "I have created a human, but the work is yours. Let him bear the load of the gods." 14 pieces of clay, 7 male, 7 female, are formed. The birth goddess places them in the wombs of divine birth mothers. The gestation period is 10 months. Then the first humans emerge, fully formed, ready to work. And they do work. The text describes humans taking over the canals, the irrigation systems, the agricultural infrastructure that the Igigi abandoned. The load is transferred. The gods are freed from physical labour. The problem is solved. Until it isn't. Because humans reproduce. And after 1200 years, the text is precise. There are so many humans making so much noise that Enlil cannot sleep. The solution to the labour problem has created an overpopulation problem. The world is full of workers, and their presence disturbs the divine order. Enlil decides to reduce the human population. He sends plague. But Ea, protective of his creations, teaches humans to offer sacrifices specifically to Namtar, the plague god, flattering him into stopping the epidemic. 1200 years later, Enlil tries again, this time with drought. Ea intervenes again, instructing humans to redirect worship toward Adad, the storm god, who brings rain out of embarrassed gratitude. Another 1200 years, and Enlil tries famine, cutting off food supplies. Again, Ea finds a workaround. Finally, enraged at Ea's repeated interference, Enlil decrees a flood, not a local event, a cosmic inundation. The divine council agrees. They will drown the world and start over, or perhaps simply eliminate humanity entirely and return to the pre-labour strike arrangement. But Ea cannot directly warn humans, because he has been made to swear an oath before the divine council not to reveal the plan. So he employs the same kind of technical compliance that appears throughout ancient legal and mythological texts. He speaks not to the human king Atrahasis, but to the wall of Atrahasis's reed hut. He tells the wall exactly what is coming and exactly what must be done to survive it. The wall, of course, has ears. Now, the standard reading of this narrative treats it as mythology with ethical and theological themes. It explores the relationship between gods and humans, the problem of divine justice, the tension between creation and destruction. It functions as a theodicy, an explanation for why suffering exists, why the gods sometimes seem capricious, why catastrophe strikes the innocent. This reading is entirely valid. The Atrahasis epic is clearly mythological literature serving theological purposes. But there's another way to read it, a way that asks not what does this mean theologically, but what is this describing procedurally? If we strip away the divine actors and look only at the actions, the Atrahasis epic describes 1. A large-scale infrastructure project, canal excavation, river management, irrigation system construction across lower Mesopotamia. 2. A labour force organised into hierarchical levels, with some groups supervising and others performing physical work. 3. A labour revolt after prolonged exploitation. 4. The creation or introduction of a new labour force to replace the rebels. 5. Rapid population growth of this new labour force leading to resource strain. 6. Multiple attempts to manage population through disastrous drought. 7. A catastrophic flooding event. 8. Survival of a small group with advanced knowledge. 9. Repopulation and reorganisation of civilization after the flood. Stripped of theology, this is a procedural account. It describes who did what, when, and why. It describes the sequence of events leading to a crisis and the measures taken to manage that crisis. Could the Atrahasis epic preserve memory, however mythologized, of actual pre-flood civilization? A civilization organized enough to undertake massive hydraulic projects, hierarchical enough to have labor disputes, technologically sophisticated enough to create or introduce new populations. Mainstream scholarship says no. The text is too obviously mythological, too filled with divine actors and supernatural events to be read as disguised history. The creation of humans from clay and divine blood is fantasy, not biology. The gods are theological constructs, not historical actors. This is almost certainly correct. But that leaves us with a question about the infrastructure, because irrigation canals don't mythologize themselves. River management systems don't appear in oral tradition unless someone built them. The procedural knowledge embedded in the text, how to organize large-scale labor, how to dig canal systems, how to manage water resources, doesn't arise spontaneously. It comes from experience. So even if the gods are metaphor, even if the divine council is symbolic, the labor described is not. Somebody built canals. Somebody organized workers. Somebody engineered the transformation of Mesopotamia from arid plain to agricultural heartland. The Atrahasis epic insists this happened before the flood, before the great catastrophe that separated antediluvian time from historical time, before the event that, if we correlate it with geology, marks the end of the Ice Age and the inundation of lowland regions. And if there was infrastructure before the flood, there were cities to support it. Cities assigned to specific gods. Cities built according to divine plan. Let's look at what the texts say about those cities, because the earliest inscriptions don't describe building them, they describe assigning them, as if they already existed, waiting to be claimed. The architecture of survival. The Barton cylinder, catalogue number CBS 8383, rests in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. It is older than the Well-Blundell prism, older than the Atrahasis tablets, older than almost every piece of Sumerian literature we possess. Inscribed around 2400 years before the Common Era, early dynastic period, mid-3rd millennium, it is one of the earliest extended texts in the Sumerian language. The cylinder describes the creation of cities, not their physical construction, but their assignment. The text is fragmentary, but the preserved portions show a pattern. Each city is given to a specific deity, who becomes its patron and protector. Eridu is assigned to Enki, Nippur to Enlil, to the moon god Nana. The formula repeats: city name, deity name, assignment. What the text does not describe is anyone building these cities. They exist. The gods claim them, assign functions to them, establish their roles within the cosmic and political order, but the cities themselves are treated as already present, already functional, ready to be integrated into the divine plan. This is not unique to the Barton cylinder. Multiple early Sumerian texts, particularly temple foundation inscriptions and city hymns, treat cities as having been founded when kingship descended from heaven, or when the gods established the me. They are ancient beyond memory, their origins lying in the mythological past, their structures part of the primordial order. Of course, we know that Eridu, Uruk, and other Sumerian cities were built by humans over centuries of gradual development. Archaeological excavation shows this clearly. Eridu began as a small shrine in the Ubaid period, around 400 years ago. Layer by layer, the temple was rebuilt, expanded, elaborated, until by the early dynastic period it was a major religious complex. The process was slow, incremental, entirely human in scale. But the texts don't describe that process. They skip it. They begin with cities already existing, already sacred, already assigned. Why? One explanation: the texts are mythological and therefore ignore mundane construction details in favour of cosmic significance. When you're narrating how the gods organise the world, you don't pause to discuss bricklaying techniques. You focus on divine assignment, not human labour. Another explanation: the texts preserve memory of cities founded so long ago that their actual construction had passed out of living knowledge. By the time scribes began writing these accounts, Eridu and were already ancient. Their origins were unknown, so they were attributed to the gods, a common pattern in cultures where monumental architecture predates written records. A third explanation: the texts are describing not physical construction, but something else. The establishment of cities as sacred centres, the moment when a settlement becomes a city through divine recognition and assignment. The physical buildings might have existed for generations, but the city as a cosmic entity comes into being when the gods claim it. All of these are plausible, but let's consider the architectural details that do appear in early Sumerian texts. Because while construction methods are rarely described, architectural specifications are. Temple foundation inscriptions list measurements, heights, widths, depths. They specify materials, baked brick versus unbaked, cedar beams from Lebanon, bitumen for waterproofing. They describe foundation rituals, offerings placed in cornerstone deposits, divine statues installed in inner sanctums, doorways aligned to celestial events. City hymns praise architectural features, walls reaching to heaven, gates gleaming like sunlight, streets laid out in grid patterns, irrigation canals flowing through urban districts, ziggurat platforms rising in step stages. These are not vague poetic flourishes. They are descriptions of real architectural accomplishments, engineering feats that required planning, materials, skilled labour and time. And multiple texts reference antediluvian architecture. The Eridu Genesis fragment mentions cities built before the flood. The Sumerian King List places 5 cities in the antediluvian period. The Atrahasis epic describes infrastructure projects, canals, irrigation systems undertaken before the catastrophe. If these texts preserve any historical memory, then architecture existed before the flood, not primitive shelters, organised cities, built environments, infrastructure. What would that look like in practice? Let's start with geography. During the Ice Age, sea levels were 120 to 130 metres lower than today. The Persian Gulf was dry land, a river valley through which the Tigris and Euphrates flowed as a single merged waterway. The coastline lay far to the south, near the Strait of Hormuz. Between the modern Gulf Coast and that ancient shoreline stretched hundreds of kilometres of exposed continental shelf, flat, well-watered lowland, fed by the great rivers and their tributaries. If human populations settled this region during the late Pleistocene, between 20,000 and 12,000 years ago, they would have built in areas that are now submerged. Any cities, any settlements, any monumental architecture constructed in this lowland zone would be underwater today, buried beneath Gulf sediments, invisible to archaeology unless we dredge the seafloor. This is not speculation. Marine archaeologists have found submerged landscape features in the Persian Gulf, ancient river channels, terrestrial soil deposits, evidence of freshwater springs that functioned when the Gulf was dry. The land existed. It was habitable. The question is whether anyone lived there, and if they did, whether they built anything permanent. Conventional archaeology says no. Pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers don't build cities. They don't construct monumental architecture. They move seasonally, follow game, live in temporary camps. Permanent settlement requires agriculture, which only developed after the Ice Age ended in the Neolithic Revolution around 10,000 years ago, except we now know that's not entirely true. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey was built starting around 9,600 years before the Common Era. It consists of massive stone pillars arranged in circular enclosures, some weighing over 10 tons, carved with elaborate reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. The site required coordinated labour, planning and sustained effort, and it was built before agriculture by people who were still primarily hunter-gatherers. Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Karahan Tepe, another pre-pottery Neolithic site in Turkey, shows similar monumental architecture. Jericho's stone tower dates to the 8th millennium before the Common Era. Atalhik, though slightly later, demonstrates sophisticated urban planning in a pre-literate society. These sites prove that monumental construction can precede agriculture, that organised labour can be mobilised before the development of food production, that the standard model, hunting and gathering leads to agriculture, agriculture leads to cities, is too simple. If hunter-gatherer societies could build Göbekli Tepe, what could more advanced societies build? If pre-pottery Neolithic groups could organise labour for monument construction, could late Pleistocene cultures have built urban centres, not necessarily cities as we understand them, but permanent settlements, regional centres, perhaps even proto-urban complexes? The problem is evidence, or rather the absence of it. If such places existed, and if they were built in the lowland regions that are now submerged, we wouldn't find them. They would be gone, drowned by the rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. Which brings us back to the Sumerian texts. The Sumerians appear in Lower Mesopotamia with cities already developed, writing already functional, religious traditions already complex. There is no primitive phase in Sumerian archaeology. The Ubaid period, the earliest confirmed Sumerian presence, already shows irrigation agriculture, temple architecture, long-distance trade, social stratification. It's as if the cultural package arrives complete. Archaeologists explain this as regional development building on earlier cultures, Halaf, Samara, others, whose traditions fed into the Sumerian synthesis. This is undoubtedly part of the story, but it doesn't fully explain why Sumerian texts insist their civilization was not invented, but restored. Restored from what? From where? If we take the text seriously, the answer is from before the flood, from the antediluvian cities, from the period when Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar and Shuruppak were already functioning centres, already assigned to gods, already integrated into a cosmic order. And if the flood marks the end of the Ice Age and the inundation of lowland Mesopotamia, then the antediluvian cities might have existed in the now submerged river valley. When the waters rose, those cities drowned. Populations migrated upland to higher ground, to the regions where we now find archaeological remains. They rebuilt in new locations, but they carried with them the memory of what had been lost. The city names, the divine assignments, the sacred geography, the knowledge that they were not starting from nothing, but continuing something older. This reading is speculative. It requires accepting that oral tradition can preserve geographic and institutional memory across thousands of years, a claim that remains controversial in archaeology. It requires believing that human societies were more sophisticated in the late Pleistocene than standard models allow. It requires interpreting mythological texts as containing historical kernels beneath their theological elaboration. But it has one advantage: it explains why the Sumerians believed what they believed, not because they were inventing comforting origin myths, but because they were recording what their ancestors told them, that there were cities before, that there was organization before, that the flood was not the beginning, but a rupture, a terrible break, separating the world that was from the world that had to be rebuilt. And if that's true, then the architecture existed, the infrastructure existed, the cities existed, not in the locations we can excavate, but in the valleys now drowned, waiting beneath the gulf, waiting, perhaps, with something else, something the texts call me, the divine decrees, the patterns of civilization, the knowledge itself, the me, blueprints or memory. In Sumerian mythology, the me are divine decrees, fundamental aspects of civilization, encoded somehow in portable objects. The word me has no precise translation. It means something like essence, attribute, power, or archetypal pattern. The me govern everything: kingship, priesthood, warfare, music, metalworking, writing, sexual behavior, law, agriculture, craftsmanship. There are lists enumerating anywhere from 60 to over 100 me, depending on the text. The me are not abstract concepts. In the myths, they are physical objects that can be stolen, transported, given as gifts, lost and recovered. They are power, but they are also things, objects that embody power. The most famous story about the me appears in the cycle of myths about Inanna, goddess of love and war. In this narrative, Inanna travels to Eridu, the city of Enki, god of wisdom and the freshwater deep. Enki welcomes her with a feast. They drink beer together. As the drinking continues, Enki becomes generous or careless. He begins giving Inanna one by one until she has accumulated dozens of them, the me of kingship, priesthood, truth, descent to the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the art of warfare, decision-making, the craft of the carpenter, the craft of the smith, and many others. Once Inanna has loaded the me into her boat, she flees Eridu and returns to her own city, Uruk. Enki, sobering up, realizes what he has done and sends monsters to pursue her and recover the me. But Inanna's helper, Ninshruba, defends her, and the me reach Uruk safely. Inanna distributes them throughout her city, and Uruk becomes a great centre of civilization as a result. On the surface, this is a myth about the transfer of cultural authority from Eridu to Uruk, reflecting real political shifts in early Mesopotamian history. It's also a story about gender and divine politics, with the clever goddess outsmarting the drunk god. But focus on the me themselves. What are they? If they are merely abstract ideas, kingship as a concept, metalworking as a general skill, why can they be placed in a boat? Why can they be physically transported? Why would losing them diminish Eridu and gaining them elevate Uruk? The texts treat the me as objects, not symbols of authority, but actual containers of knowledge, technique, power. When Inanna takes the me to Uruk, she brings something tangible, something that can be studied, copied, implemented, something that enables Uruk to develop capabilities it didn't have before. What if the me are not theological metaphors, but references to actual knowledge storage? In later Mesopotamian tradition, temple libraries house tablet collections, medical texts, mathematical tables, astronomical observations, legal codes, ritual procedures, literary works. These tablets were copied and recopied across generations, transmitted from city to city, preserved as repositories of civilizational knowledge. Losing a library meant losing knowledge. Gaining a library meant gaining capabilities. Could the me mythology preserve memory of earlier knowledge transmission systems? Not necessarily written tablets. Cuneiform writing only appears around 200 years before the Common Era, but something older. Oral traditions encoded in memorized formulas. Craft knowledge passed through apprenticeship. Ritual procedures taught in temple schools. Geographic and astronomical knowledge embedded in sacred narratives. If pre-flood civilization existed, it had knowledge. Methods for irrigation, architecture, agriculture, social organization, astronomical observation, navigation, resource management. That knowledge had to be transmitted across generations. And if catastrophic flooding destroyed cities, libraries and populations, the knowledge would be lost, unless someone preserved it, unless someone loaded it into a boat and carried it through the disaster. This is what the flood narratives describe. Not just physical survival, but knowledge survival. In the Eridu Genesis, Enki warns Ziusudra not only to build a boat, but to preserve the seed of mankind. What does that mean? Biological reproduction, certainly, but perhaps also cultural reproduction, the transmission of knowledge, skills, traditions, everything needed to rebuild civilization after the waters recede. In the Atrahasis epic, Atrahasis takes his family onto the boat, along with animals and supplies, but he also takes craftsmen. The text is fragmentary, but references suggest that representatives of essential professions, builders, farmers, smiths, are included in the survivor group, not randomly, but deliberately, so that when the flood ends, the knowledge needed to rebuild is still available. In the Gilgamesh epic, Utnapishtim is granted immortality after surviving the flood. But more than that, he is placed on an island at the edge of the world, a liminal space, outside normal geography, where he becomes a keeper of memory. When Gilgamesh, centuries later, seeks him out, Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood. The knowledge is preserved. The memory is passed down. All three narratives emphasize preservation, not just of people, but of knowledge. Because civilization is not cities and irrigation canals, those can be rebuilt. Civilization is knowing how to build cities and irrigation canals. Civilization is knowledge encoded in human minds and transmitted through teaching. The me represent that knowledge, and the myth of Inanna and Enki describes its transmission from one city to another, from one generation to another, from before the catastrophe to after. If this reading is correct, then the me are not fantasy. They are a mythologized memory of knowledge preservation during a crisis. The boat in which Inanna carries them might be metaphorical, a teaching lineage, an institutional structure, a migration of trained specialists. Or it might be partly literal, physical objects like stone tablets, knotted cords, carved symbols, whatever pre-writing knowledge storage systems existed. We know such systems existed. Andean cultures used quipus, knotted cords, to record complex numerical and narrative information. Aboriginal Australian cultures encode geographic and navigational knowledge in songlines. Polynesian navigators transmitted star maps and ocean current patterns through oral tradition with extraordinary precision. Knowledge storage does not require writing, it requires institutions dedicated to memory. If pre-flood civilization had such institutions, and if the flood narratives preserve memory of their survival, then the me are real, not as magical objects, but as the knowledge they represent. And that knowledge includes something very specific: instructions for surviving a flood, boat specifications, supply requirements, timing, duration. Let's look at those instructions, because they are disturbingly precise. Too precise for comfortable mythology, Enki's warning to the wall. The Eridu Genesis fragment CBS 10673 preserves only the lower third of what was once a complete tablet, but what remains is extraordinary. The text describes Ziusudra, king of Shurupuk, standing beside a wall. The wall speaks, or rather someone speaks to the wall, and Ziusudra, standing nearby, overhears. The speaker is Enki, god of wisdom, fresh water and craftsmanship, and what he tells the wall is a detailed survival protocol. The preserved lines are fragmentary, but the sequence is clear. Ziusudra is instructed to abandon his house and build a boat. The boat must be constructed according to specific dimensions. It must be waterproof. It must be provisioned with food and supplies for an extended duration. Animals must be taken aboard, and Ziusudra must watch for a signal, a specific timing when the flood will begin. The text breaks off, then resumes with the flood in progress. 7 days and 7 nights of storm, waters rising. Then the sun returns, and Ziusudra opens the boat's hatch. He offers sacrifices to An and Enlil. The gods who had decreed the flood now grant Ziusudra eternal life and place him in Dilmun, a sacred island, as a reward for his obedience and survival. This narrative structure repeats in the later Akkadian versions, Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, but with far more detail. In the Gilgamesh epic, Tablet C, Utnapishtim recounts the same events to Gilgamesh, and here we get specifications. Enki, called Ea in the Akkadian version, speaks not to Utnapishtim directly, but to the reed wall of his house. Reed house, wall, wall. Listen, reed house. Understand wall. The instruction is delivered through this indirect method, allowing Ea to comply technically with his oath, not to warn humanity, while still ensuring the message reaches the right person. The boat's dimensions: let her be equal in length and breadth. A cube. The sides are to measure 120 cubits each, approximately 60 meters if we assume the standard Mesopotamian cubit. The interior is divided into compartments, 7 decks, 9 sections per deck. The structure is to be waterproofed with bitumen inside and out. 6 sar of bitumen I poured into the kiln, 3 sar of pitch I poured inside. These are specific quantities, named materials, technical procedures. Utnapishtim is told to load the boat with provisions, all the silver I had, all the gold I had, all the living creatures I had. His family, his relatives, craftsmen, animals, domesticated and wild, seeds of every plant. The boat is a mobile repository, a survival capsule containing everything needed to restart civilization. The timing, When Shamash, the sun god, announces a specific sign, Utnapishtim is to enter the boat and seal the door. That night, the storm begins. The text describes the experience from inside. The terror of the storm overwhelmed me. I looked at the weather, it was frightful to behold. I entered the boat and closed the door. For 6 days and 6 nights, 7 in the Sumerian version, the flood continues. The wind blew, the storm was furious, the flood advanced. The storm raged like a battle. No one could see anyone else. The gods were frightened by the deluge. They fled and ascended to the heaven of Anu. The gods crouched like dogs at the outer wall. When the storm ends, the boat has grounded on Mount Nisir. Utnapishtim waits 7 days, then sends out birds, first a dove, which returns because it finds no resting place, then a swallow, which also returns, finally a raven, which does not return, indicating that the waters have receded enough for land to reappear. Utnapishtim descends, builds an altar, and offers sacrifice. I poured out a libation on the summit of the mountain. I set up 7 and 7 cult vessels. Into the bottom of them I poured reeds, cedar, and myrtle. The gods smelled the savour. The gods smelled the sweet savour. The gods gathered like flies over the sacrifice. This is not vague mythology. These are instructions, dimensions, materials, procedures, timing, signals. What to bring, how long to wait, how to test whether it is safe to emerge. Compare this to procedural texts from other ancient cultures, construction manuals, medical recipes, ritual instructions. They have the same character, step-by-step directions, specific quantities, named materials, expected outcomes. The flood narrative reads like an engineering manual embedded in a mythological frame. Why? If this is pure invention, why include technical details? If you're creating a theological narrative about divine justice and cosmic order, why specify bitumen quantities? Why describe a cube-shaped boat with 7 decks? Why include the bird testing procedure? One answer: the details add verisimilitude. They make the story feel more real, more grounded, more believable. Literary craftsmen include specific details to enhance narrative immersion. Another answer: the details are ritual. The flood story was recited in temple contexts, and the specificity serves ceremonial purposes, establishing the sacred authority of the text through formulaic precision. A third answer: the details are inherited from an older tradition that actually was instructional, and later mythological retellings preserve those details even as the context shifted. If the third answer is correct, then the flood narratives originated as survival protocols, instructions for what to do when catastrophic flooding threatens a coastal or lowland settlement. Build a boat, make it watertight, stock it with provisions and seeds, take craftsmen who know essential skills, watch for weather signals. When the storm comes, seal yourself in. Wait. When it ends, test cautiously before emerging. Rebuild. This is practical knowledge, the kind of knowledge that a civilization threatened by rising sea levels would develop and transmit. Not knowledge about a single flood event, but knowledge about how to survive flood events in general, whether from storm surges, river overflow, or long-term sea level rise. If late Pleistocene or early Holocene populations in lower Mesopotamia faced exactly this threat, generations of rising water as the Ice Age ended and sea levels climbed, they would have needed exactly this kind of knowledge, and they would have passed it down as carefully as they passed down any other survival skill. How to dig a well, how to plant barley, how to survive a flood. Over time, as the immediate threat receded and populations resettled in higher, safer regions, the procedural knowledge would have been retained but reframed. No longer an active manual, but a sacred memory. No longer here's what to do when the waters rise, but here's what our ancestor did when the great waters rose. The instructions become narrative. The protagonist becomes mythologized. The gods enter the story to provide theological context, but the core remains: the dimensions, the bitumen, the 7 days. The birds. Could this really preserve memory of Ice Age flooding? Or is it simply detailed fiction? The question hinges on timeline. The Eridu Genesis dates to around 1650 years before the Common Era. The Atrahasis and Gilgamesh versions are similar in age. These texts were written more than 3,000 years after the end of the Ice Age. Can oral tradition preserve specific technical details across that span? Some anthropologists say yes. Studies of Aboriginal Australian traditions show retention of geographic information, coastline descriptions, island locations, corresponding to landscapes submerged more than 7,000 years ago. Polynesian navigation traditions preserve star maps and ocean routes across millennia. The Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004 found that certain indigenous communities in the Andaman Islands survived because they heeded oral traditions about ocean behaviour and fled to high ground, traditions that likely originated in previous tsunami centuries earlier. Human memory, especially when institutionalised through ritual repetition and teaching lineages, can be remarkably persistent. Not perfect, details drift, meanings change, but core information, geographic, procedural, astronomical, can survive far longer than we typically assume. If that's true, then the flood instructions in Sumerian texts might be genuine memory, not of a single flood in 3000 BC, but of the flooding process that occurred between 11,000 and 8,000 BC as sea levels rose and the Persian Gulf formed. Memory preserved by populations who survived the transition and carried the knowledge inland to the settlements that became Eridu, Uruk, Ur, which raises a final question about the instructions. If they are genuine survival knowledge, do they work? Could you actually build a boat according to these specifications and survive a major flood? The answer appears to be yes. In 2014, a British researcher named Irving Finkel, working from a different Babylonian flood tablet, built a scale model of the boat described in that version, which specifies a circular coracle design rather than a cube. The model, when tested, was stable and seaworthy. It could carry the specified cargo, it could float for extended periods. The design was functional. The cube-shaped boat in Gilgamesh is stranger, less obviously seaworthy by modern standards. But naval architects who have analysed the specifications note that a cube provides maximum interior volume for a given amount of material, ideal for a vessel meant to carry cargo rather than travel distance. It would be stable if properly ballasted. It wouldn't sail well, but it doesn't need to. It only needs to float until the waters recede. The design works, the materials work, the procedure works, which leaves us with an uncomfortable possibility. The Sumerian flood narratives might not be mythology at all. They might be user manuals, survival protocols, engineering specifications, written down in the form of stories because that's how knowledge was transmitted, but preserving genuine technical information beneath the theological elaboration. And if that's true, then whoever developed this knowledge did so through experience, through trial and error, through surviving floods and learning what worked, which means floods happened, not once, repeatedly, over a long enough period that populations developed, tested, and refined survival strategies, which matches exactly what happened at the end of the Ice Age. Not a single catastrophic deluge, but centuries of rising water, punctuated by storm surges and river overflows, as coastal populations retreated step by step before the advancing sea. The texts say civilization existed before the flood, and that after the flood it was restored. If the flood is not a single event, but a long crisis, then restoration means carrying knowledge through that crisis, from the world that was drowning to the world that would emerge afterward. The me in boats, the instructions to the wall, the craftsman on the ark, the seed of mankind, all describe the same thing, knowledge transmission during catastrophe. But there's another kind of knowledge in these texts, knowledge about what came before, about how advanced antediluvian civilization was, about what they built, and some of it shouldn't have been possible. The towers before the flood. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began excavations at a site in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill. What he found redefined our understanding of pre-agricultural societies. Göbekli Tepe consists of massive stone circles, T-shaped pillars arranged in rings, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing more than 10 tons. The pillars are carved with elaborate reliefs, lions, bulls, foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, abstract symbols. The craftsmanship is sophisticated. The organisation required to quarry, transport and erect these stones implies coordinated labour from a large population. The site dates to the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, between 9600 and 8200 years before the Common Era. It was built by hunter-gatherers. No evidence of agriculture, no domesticated plants or animals except dogs, no permanent residential structures nearby. The builders appear to have lived in seasonal camps and gathered periodically at Göbekli Tepe for construction and ritual. This should not exist. According to the standard model of human development, monumental architecture requires agriculture. Agriculture provides surplus food. Surplus food allows population concentration. Population concentration enables specialised labour. Specialised labour builds monuments. No agriculture means no surplus, means no monuments. Göbekli Tepe reverses the sequence. Monuments first, agriculture later. The standard model is wrong. Since Schmidt's discovery, more pre-pottery Neolithic sites with monumental architecture have been identified in the region. Karahan Tepe, Harbetsuvan Tepesi, Sefer Tepe all show similar patterns: large stone constructions, organised labour, no agriculture. Together they suggest that across the northern arc of the Fertile Crescent, late Pleistocene and early Holocene populations were building permanent ritual centres, temple complexes, gathering places, astronomical observatories, long before they settled into farming villages. Why does this matter for understanding Sumerian flood narratives? Because it proves that complex social organisation and sophisticated construction existed earlier than we thought, that hunter-gatherers were not necessarily nomadic and simple, that the capabilities required to build cities, labour organisation, craft specialisation, architectural planning were present before the development of agriculture. If populations in Turkey could build Göbekli Tepe around 9600 BC, what were populations doing in the Persian Gulf basin at the same time? The Gulf was still dry land. The river valley was rich, well-watered, ecologically diverse. It would have been prime habitat for late Pleistocene human groups. We have no direct evidence of settlements there because the entire region is now underwater. The archaeological record is erased. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. If we found Göbekli Tepe in Turkey and Jericho's Tower in the Levant and Atalhik in Anatolia, all dating to the 9th, 8th and 7th millennia BC, why assume the Persian Gulf lowlands were empty? The Sumerian King List places 5 cities in the antediluvian period: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. If those names preserve memory of actual settlements in the now submerged valley, and if those settlements were contemporary with Göbekli Tepe, then we should expect them to have had similar capabilities: organised labour, monument construction, ritual centres, craft specialisation, not full cities in the classical sense, walled urban centres with dense populations and economic stratification, but proto-urban sites, regional centres, temple complexes, places where populations gathered, built permanent structures, developed traditions that later informed urban Sumerian culture. This is speculative, but it's not impossible, and it fits the textual evidence better than the standard dismissal. The texts say cities existed before the flood. If the flood marks the end Pleistocene sea level rise that drowned the Gulf lowlands between 11,000 and 8,000 years ago, then the antediluvian cities would date to roughly the same period as Göbekli Tepe, not Bronze Age cities like Uruk or Ur, but pre-pottery Neolithic centres. places where populations gathered, built, worshipped, and developed the cultural patterns that later evolved into Sumerian civilization. When the waters rose and those centres were abandoned, populations migrated to higher ground. They carried with them memory of the places they left behind, the city names, the divine associations, the sense that their civilization was not new, but restored. And they carried something else, building knowledge, how to organise labour, how to construct platforms and monuments, how to align structures to celestial events, how to manage water through canals and irrigation. The Atrahasis epic describes canal excavation as antediluvian work performed by the Igigi gods. If we strip away the divine actors, what remains is a description of hydraulic engineering, large-scale earth moving to manage water flow. This is precisely the kind of knowledge required to settle Lower Mesopotamia successfully in the post-flood period. The Ubaid culture, earliest confirmed Sumerian presence, shows sophisticated irrigation systems from its first appearance. Where did that knowledge come from? Either it was developed independently after the flood, or it was inherited from earlier populations who had already learned how to manage water in the pre-flood lowlands. Inheritance is simpler. It explains why Sumerian culture appears fully formed. It explains why the earliest texts reference antediluvian precedents. It explains why cities are assigned to gods rather than described as being built, because from the perspective of the text composers, those cities were ancient beyond memory, their origins in the world before the waters. Let's be clear about what this hypothesis does and does not claim. It does not claim that Sumerians descended from Atlantis, ancient aliens, or lost super civilizations with laser technology. It does not claim that antediluvian Mesopotamia had Bronze Age metallurgy, writing, or state-level political organization. It claims only this: populations in the Persian Gulf lowlands during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, the same period that produced Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, might have developed regional centres with monumental architecture, organised ritual, craft specialisation and hydraulic knowledge. When rising sea levels flooded that region between 11,000 and 8,000 BC, those populations migrated to higher elevations and eventually settled the areas we now call Eridu, Uruk and Ur. They carried with them cultural memory of the abandoned centres, which became mythologized as the antediluvian cities. The knowledge they preserved, construction techniques, water management, social organisation, formed the foundation of later Sumerian urban culture. This is not a radical claim. It's an extension of what we already know about pre-pottery Neolithic societies. It simply places similar developments in a region we cannot excavate because it is submerged. The advantage of this model is that it takes Sumerian texts seriously without requiring belief in impossibly ancient civilizations. It accepts that the antediluvian section of the King List is not literal history, the reign lengths are clearly symbolic, but it treats the geographic and cultural information as potentially meaningful rather than purely fictional. The disadvantage is that it is unfalsifiable without underwater archaeology in the Persian Gulf, which is expensive, difficult, and has barely begun. But there is one more piece of evidence we can examine. Not architecture, not texts, but the event itself. The flood described in so much detail in the Sumerian narratives. If it corresponds to the end Pleistocene inundation, then the flood narratives should describe what actually happened geologically, not metaphorically, specifically. The timing, the duration, the water sources, the aftermath. Let's compare the text to the science, because the match is better than it should be. When the floodgates opened, the flood narratives, Eridu Genesis, Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, agree on several details despite being separated by centuries and composed in different languages. These consistencies suggest a shared core tradition, and those shared details are worth examining closely. First, duration. The Eridu Genesis specifies 7 days and 7 nights. Gilgamesh Tablet C specifies 6 days and nights of storm, with the flood ending on the 7th day. Atrahasis is less precise, but describes a prolonged storm followed by cessation. 7 days recurs across versions. Second, water sources. The texts describe water coming from both above and below. In Gilgamesh, the Anunnaki lifted up the torches, setting the land ablaze with their flare. The stillness of the storm god passed over the sky, turning all light to darkness. For 1 day the south wind blew, gathering speed, submerging the mountains. The imagery combines storm flooding and rising groundwater or seawater below. Third, totality. The texts insist this was not a local river flood, but a world-altering event. The flood came. Its power overwhelmed the people like a battle. No one could see anyone else. They could not recognize each other in the catastrophe. The inhabited world is submerged. Mountains are covered, or at least lowland regions that seemed as vast as mountains to the inhabitants. Fourth, aftermath. When the flood ends, the survivor's boat has grounded on a mountain, Nisir in Gilgamesh, and the waters slowly recede. The bird testing procedure confirms that land is reappearing, but not yet habitable. Eventually, the survivor descends and finds a changed landscape. The gods, starving without human offerings, gather around his sacrifice. Now let's compare this to what actually happened geologically at the end of the Ice Age. The Younger Dryas cold period ended abruptly around 11,700 years ago. Greenland ice cores show temperature increases of 10 degrees Celsius within a few decades, possibly within a single decade. The ice sheets covering North America and Eurasia, already weakened by millennia of warming before the Younger Dryas, began collapsing catastrophically. Meltwater poured into the oceans. Sea levels rose. Rates varied, but during certain periods, particularly associated with meltwater pulses, like meltwater pulse 1b around 11,300 years ago, sea level rise accelerated to 4 meters per century or more, 40 millimeters per year, visible within a single human lifetime. For populations living on low-lying coasts, this was catastrophic. Not a single flood event, but a grinding, relentless advance of the sea. Year by year, decade by decade, the shoreline crept inland. Settlements had to be abandoned. River mouths drowned. Valleys filled. What had been coastal plains became shallow seas. The Persian Gulf, dry during the glacial maximum, began flooding from the south as the Indian Ocean rose. At the same time, increased rainfall, one of the effects of warming temperatures, swelled the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which flowed through the Gulf basin. The basin filled from both ends. By around 8,000 years ago, the entire modern Gulf was submerged. This process took millennia, but within that long trend, there were shorter events, storm surges, monsoon floods, catastrophic river overflows. Any of these could produce the kind of week-long inundation described in the texts. A coastal storm surge, driven by cyclonic weather, could flood a lowland settlement for days. A river basin could fill rapidly during exceptional rainfall, drowning the valley floor before receding. If populations in the Gulf lowlands experienced such events multiple times over several millennia, each flood forcing migration to higher ground, each recovery period seeing reoccupation of the valleys until the next flood, they would develop exactly the kind of survival knowledge encoded in the flood narratives. And eventually, one flood would be different, not because the storm was worse, but because the underlying sea level had risen enough that the waters didn't fully recede. The valley stayed drowned. The shoreline had permanently shifted. What had been dry land was now marine territory. Recovery meant not returning to the old sites, but permanently resettling at higher elevations. That final transition from repeatedly flooding valleys that could be reoccupied to permanent inundation would be remembered as the flood, the event that separated before from after. Not because it was a single catastrophic deluge unlike anything before, but because it was the flood after which return was impossible. This matches the textual descriptions. The flood narratives don't describe instant global drowning. They describe a storm, a week of rising water, a grounding on high terrain, a slow recession, and then, critically, a world that has changed. The survivor descends from the mountain and finds a landscape transformed. The cities are gone. The population is gone. Civilization must be rebuilt. This is not myth. This is lived experience of coastal populations during rapid sea level rise. The 7-day duration matches storm cycle patterns. Major cyclonic events, monsoons, tropical storms, typically last several days to a week before dissipating. The water from above and below matches storm surge combined with rising sea level. The totality reflects the perspective of lowland inhabitants for whom the valley they knew was entirely submerged. The aftermath, changed landscape, lost settlements, need to rebuild, matches what happens when sea level rise permanently floods a coastal plain. Every major detail fits. But there's a problem with this reading. If the flood narratives preserve memory of gradual sea level rise over millennia, why do they present it as a single event? Why compress a long process into 7 days? One answer: narrative compression. Oral traditions condense complex historical processes into story frameworks. Multiple floods merge into a single archetypal flood. Generational migration becomes a single journey. Centuries of change collapse into a single catastrophic moment. Another answer: the texts might preserve memory of a specific event, one particularly severe storm surge or river flood, that became symbolic of the entire process. The worst flood in living memory, which destroyed enough settlements simultaneously that it marked a turning point, after which the populations realized return was impossible and permanent migration was necessary. A third answer: the 7 days might encode something other than literal duration. 7 is a sacred number in Mesopotamian cosmology. It appears throughout Sumerian and Akkadian literature as a ritual period, a sacred cycle, a complete unit. The 7 days and nights might mean a complete cycle of destruction rather than a precise calendar week. Any of these explanations allows the flood narrative to preserve historical memory while acknowledging that mythological reframing has occurred. But here's what we can say with confidence. The end Pleistocene inundation of the Persian Gulf Basin was real. It happened. It displaced populations. It drowned settlements. And the Sumerian texts insist their civilization existed before a great flood and was restored afterward. The timeline matches, the geography matches, the process matches, which brings us to the aftermath. If populations survived the flooding of the lowlands and migrated to higher ground, they carried knowledge with them, but they also carried something else: trauma, grief, loss, the memory of a world that no longer existed. And when they offered sacrifices on the mountains where they had taken refuge, they were not performing empty ritual. They were feeding the gods who had starved during the catastrophe. Or, stripped of theology, they were re-establishing the ritual patterns that maintained social cohesion. They were affirming that despite the loss, the cosmic order remained. That civilization could continue. Let's look at that scene, the sacrifice after the flood, because it reveals something crucial about the relationship between gods and humans in these texts, something that challenges how we interpret the entire narrative. The sacrifice that saved humanity. The Gilgamesh Tablet C, after describing the flood and the grounding of the boat on Mount Nisir, continues with Utnapishtim's account of what happened when he emerged. I opened the hatch, and light fell upon my face. I looked at the world. All was silence. The sea was flat. All of mankind had turned to clay. I sat down and wept, tears running down my face. The landscape is empty. The valleys below, which had been inhabited, are drowned or abandoned. The survivor confronts the totality of the loss, but he cannot remain paralyzed. There are procedures to follow, actions required. I made an offering on the peak of the mountain. I set up 7 and 7 cult vessels. I poured reeds, cedar and myrtle into their bowls. The gods smelled the savour. The gods smelled the sweet savour. The gods gathered like flies over the sacrifice. This image, gods gathering like flies, is startling. There is nothing dignified about it. It suggests desperation, hunger, need. These are not omnipotent cosmic powers graciously accepting tribute. These are beings who require something from the sacrifice, who depend on it. The Atrahasis version makes this even clearer. The great gods were suffering thirst. They were suffering hunger. During the flood, with humanity destroyed, there were no offerings, no sacrifices, no ritual meals, and the gods, dependent on human worship for sustenance, starved. This dependency reverses the expected power dynamic. Humans are not simply servants of capricious gods who might destroy them on a whim. Humans are necessary. The gods need humanity as much as humanity needs the gods. The relationship is symbiotic, not hierarchical. From a theological perspective, this is sophisticated. It establishes that divine justice cannot be arbitrary. The gods cannot simply annihilate humanity without consequences to themselves. It explains why, despite Enlil's anger at the overpopulation of humans, the other gods resist total genocide. They understand the stakes. But strip away the theological layer and ask what this describes socially. What does it mean that the gods starved without humans? In Mesopotamian society, gods were not abstract concepts. They were embodied in statues housed in temple sanctuaries. They owned land. They received offerings, food, drink, clothing, incense. The temple estates managed these resources. Priests performed daily rituals feeding and clothing the divine statues. The entire economic and social structure of Sumerian city-states centered on temple institutions. If the temples were destroyed by flood, by war, by catastrophe, the ritual system collapsed. The gods, as institutional and economic entities, ceased to function. Priests died or scattered, landholdings were abandoned, the social order disintegrated. Rebuilding after catastrophe meant rebuilding the temple system, re-establishing the priesthood, reclaiming temple lands, restarting ritual cycles. And the first step was sacrifice, the symbolic act that affirmed the restoration of the cosmic order. That declared, we survive, the gods survive, the relationship continues. So when Utnapishtim offers sacrifice on the mountain and the gods gather eagerly, what is being described is not divine hunger for barbecued meat. It is the re-establishment of social and economic order after catastrophe. The ritual is performative. It enacts continuity. It signals that civilization, though shattered, will be rebuilt. The texts emphasize this. In Atrahasis, after the sacrifice, the gods convene to discuss what went wrong and how to prevent future catastrophes. Enlil is still angry that humans survived, but Ea argues that total destruction is counterproductive. Instead, they establish new limits, human lifespans will be shortened, fertility will be regulated, disease and death will prevent overpopulation. This is not theology. This is policy discussion, resource management. How do we maintain civilization without allowing population to exceed carrying capacity? The gods, representing institutional authorities, or perhaps the text's own authors working through real social problems, negotiate a solution. Limited lifespans, balanced population, sustainable relationship between human communities and the environment. The text presents these as divine decrees imposed on humanity, but they are also practical wisdom. Agricultural societies in marginal environments must manage population. Too many people, and the land cannot support them. Famine follows. Social collapse. Migration. War. Every early civilization faced this problem and developed cultural mechanisms to address it. Delayed marriage, infanticide, celibate priesthoods, warfare, colonization. The flood narratives frame this as divine intervention after a crisis, but the crisis described, overpopulation leading to resource strain, is real, and the solution proposed, cultural controls on reproduction and longevity expectations, reflects real social strategies. So the sacrifice scene is pivotal. It marks the transition from catastrophe to recovery, from disorder to restored order, and it clarifies the stakes. Humans and gods, or humans and their institutions, humans and their environment, humans and the cosmic order however conceived, are interdependent. Destruction of one threatens the other. Survival requires cooperation. This is a remarkably mature theological and social vision, and it emerges from a text that purports to describe events before the development of Sumerian civilization, before writing, before cities, in the antediluvian world, which raises the question once again, where did this vision come from? Is it purely the invention of early second millennium scribes working in urban temple contexts, or does it preserve, however mythologized, the ethical and social insights of earlier populations who survived real catastrophes and learned through bitter experience the requirements of sustainability? There's no way to answer that definitively, but the texts themselves insist their wisdom is inherited, passed down from before the flood, preserved through the catastrophe, restored in the new world. And they insist on something else, that after the flood, civilization was not invented, it was rebuilt in specific locations by specific populations, following patterns established before. Let's look at that rebuilding, because if the antediluvian cities drowned and post-flood cities emerged in new locations, we should see both continuity and change. The same names, the same divine assignments, but different geography, different sites, and that is exactly what we find. After the waters, rebuilding or remembering. The well-Blundell prism, after listing the 8 antediluvian kings and the 5 cities where they ruled, delivers its pivotal line, the flood swept over. Then, immediately, after the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven again, the kingship was in Kish, not Eridu, Kish, a different city, new location. The capital was moved. But kingship itself, the institution, the cosmic function, has not disappeared. It has descended from heaven again, restored. The king list continues with the first dynasty of Kish, 23 kings, with reigns measured in years rather than tens of thousands of years. The scale has changed. We have entered a different chronological framework, still legendary, still exaggerated, but within the bounds of possibility. These are kings who might have actually ruled, even if their reign lengths are inflated. After Kish, kingship moves to Iana, part of Uruk, then to Ur, then back to Kish, then to Hamazi, then again to Uruk, and so on. The pattern continues through the 3rd millennium, with kingship passing between competing city-states. The king list presents this as a single linear sequence. Kingship can only be in one place at a time, but historically these dynasties overlapped. The text is constructing a unified chronology from fragmented political realities. But here's what matters. The post-flood cities are not the same as the antediluvian cities. The antediluvian king list, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. The early post-flood king list, Kish, Uruk, Ur, Hamazi, Adab, Mari, Akshak, Akkad. Only Sippar and Shuruppak reappear later in the post-flood section, and not immediately. The major early post-flood centres, Kish, Uruk, Ur, are new. They are not claimed to be antediluvian. They emerge after the catastrophe. This is crucial. If the king list were pure invention designed to glorify specific cities, we would expect those cities to claim antediluvian origins. Uruk, the most powerful city in the early 3rd millennium, would be listed first among the antediluvian centres. But it isn't. Uruk only appears after the flood. The text respects a tradition that distinguishes between cities before and after. Eridu was first, before the flood. Kish was first, after the flood. The geography has shifted. New centres have emerged. But, and this is essential, the new centres are located in the same region, southern Mesopotamia, the same river system, the same environmental and cultural zone. This is not a migration to a completely different area. It is a resettlement within the same broad region, but at higher elevations or in locations that were marginal or uninhabited before the flood. Look at the sites archaeologically. Eridu's earliest levels date to the Ubaid period, around 5400 BC. Uruk's earliest occupation is slightly later, around 5000 BC. Emerges as a major centre around 4500 BCE. These dates are after the main period of post-glacial sea level rise, which stabilised by about 6000 BCE. If the flood in the King List corresponds to the inundation of the Persian Gulf lowlands, then the post-flood cities represent the resettlement that occurred once sea levels stabilised. Populations that had been displaced from the drowned valleys established new centres on higher ground. They brought with them their cultural traditions, their city names, their divine assignments, but they built in new locations. This explains the pattern in the King List. The antediluvian cities, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, might be names of settlements in the now submerged valley. When those settlements were abandoned, populations migrated to sites like Kish, Uruk and Ur. The new cities were founded, but they carried forward institutional and cultural continuity from the older centres. Eridu in particular shows this duality. The King List places it first among antediluvian cities. Archaeological Eridu dates to the Ubaid period after the flood. But Eridu's temple, the shrine to Enki, shows continuous rebuilding on the same spot across millennia. 18 successive temple levels, each built directly on top of the previous one. The site is treated as eternally sacred, as if its sanctity predates its physical construction. Why would a site be considered sacred before it was built? Unless the sanctity transferred from an older location. Unless Eridu originally referred to a different place, now drowned, and the name was carried to a new location that became Eridu in the known world. This is speculative, but it fits both the textual and archaeological evidence. The texts insist on antediluvian origins. The archaeology shows post-flood construction. Both can be true if the names and institutions transfer even as the physical locations change. The Me mythology supports this reading. Inanna takes the Me from Enki's city and brings them to her city. The Me are portable. They can be relocated. If a flood drowns Eridu in the lowlands, the Me of Eridu, its institutional knowledge, its ritual traditions, its sacred identity, can be carried to a new site at higher elevation, which then becomes Eridu in the rebuilt world. This is how refugee populations work. When forced to migrate, they bring with them place names, cultural identities, sacred geographies. They name new settlements after abandoned homes. They transplant traditions to new locations. The continuity is cultural, not geographic. If this model is correct, then the Sumerian King List preserves a migration narrative. Before the flood, lowland settlements in the now submerged valley. During the flood, crisis, displacement, knowledge preservation. After the flood, resettlement at higher elevation, establishment of new centres, restoration of kingship and social order. The text calls this a restoration because, from the perspective of the people who composed it, civilization did not begin with Uruk or Kish. It began with Eridu and Bad Tabira, cities whose true origins were lost in the drowned valleys, but whose cultural legacy continued in the New World. Is this what happened, or is it simply how the Sumerians chose to narrate their origins, inventing a mythological past to legitimize their present institutions? We cannot know with certainty, but we can note this. The pattern matches real historical processes. Displaced populations do preserve origin narratives. Refugee communities do maintain institutional continuity across geographic discontinuity. Civilizations that survive catastrophes do rebuild by consciously restoring what was lost. The Sumerian texts insist their civilization was restored. That kingship descended from heaven twice, once before the flood, once after. That the knowledge, the institutions, the sacred order were not created in the third millennium, but inherited from something older. And geology tells us that the region they inhabited was radically transformed between 11,000 and 6,000 years ago. That sea levels rose, that valleys drowned, that populations had to migrate. The pieces fit, not perfectly, not provably, but well enough that dismissing the texts as pure mythology feels premature. They might be mythology, but they might also be memory, preserved across millennia, encoded in narrative frameworks, distorted by time and theological elaboration, yet still pointing towards something real. Which leaves us with three possible interpretations, three ways of reading these texts and reconciling them with what we know from other sources. Let's examine each fairly, without choosing, because that choice is yours to make. Three interpretations. First interpretation, pure mythology. The antediluvian section of the Sumerian King List is theological fiction. The impossibly long reign lengths, the catastrophic flood, the pre-civilization cities, all are mythological constructs serving ideological purposes. Early scribes invented these narratives too, established divine legitimacy for human kingship by linking it to cosmic origins. Explain the relationship between gods and humans through etiological storytelling. Provide a sacred history that unified diverse Sumerian city-states under a common cultural framework. The flood functions as a literary boundary between mythological time and quasi-historical time. It separates the cosmic prologue from human history proper. It is not a memory of real events, but a narrative device. The antediluvian cities are real settlements, Eridu, Bad Tibera, Shuruppak, but their designation as pre-flood centres is symbolic. They were ancient by Sumerian standards, important religious sites, and thus retrojected into the mythological past to enhance their prestige. The flood narratives in Eridu Genesis, Atrahasis, and Gilgamesh draw on widespread Near Eastern flood mythology, local river floods, cultural memories of wet periods versus dry periods, and theological reflection on divine justice and human mortality. They are not historical reports, but literary compositions exploring existential themes. This interpretation is mainstream scholarly consensus. It is methodologically conservative, requiring no acceptance of unprovable claims. It treats the texts as literature, analyses them using standard critical methods, and situates them within the broader context of ancient Near Eastern mythology. The strengths of this interpretation: it accounts for the obviously mythological elements without special pleading. It does not require belief in lost civilizations or improbable historical scenarios. It respects the texts as meaningful theological and literary works without forcing them into a historical framework they were not designed to support. The weaknesses: it struggles to explain the geographic precision, why these specific cities in this specific sequence with this specific regional consistency across multiple versions. It does not fully address why flood mythology is so pervasive across cultures, including some with no obvious geographic reason for flood narratives. It tends to flatten the texts, treating all mythological material as equally fictional, potentially missing historical kernels embedded within the mythological framework. Second interpretation: encoded wisdom. The antediluvian narratives are not historical reports, but also not pure fiction. They are encoded wisdom traditions, philosophical and spiritual teachings, dressed in mythological garb. The antediluvian kings represent not individual rulers, but stages of cosmic development or spiritual evolution. The reign lengths encode astronomical cycles, precessional ages, or sacred numerology. The flood symbolizes not a physical event, but a spiritual transformation, the death of the old self and rebirth into higher consciousness. The cities represent not geographic locations, but interior states, chakras, or levels of initiation. Eridu is the foundation. Bad Tibera is the next stage. Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak follow in sequence, marking a path of spiritual ascent. The flood is the test, the ordeal, the dark night of the soul that the initiate must survive. The me are not physical objects, but gnosis, secret knowledge transmitted from master to student, preserved through lineages, encoded in ritual and symbol. Inanna's journey to claim the me from Enki is an allegory for the seeker's quest for wisdom. This interpretation has roots in esoteric and mystical traditions. It reads ancient texts as repositories of perennial wisdom accessible to those with the keys to decode them. It sees myth as a vehicle for truths that cannot be communicated directly but must be experienced through symbolic immersion. The strengths of this interpretation: it takes the text seriously as containing meaningful content rather than dismissing them as primitive superstition. It allows for deep engagement with symbolic and philosophical dimensions of the narratives. It explains why the same motifs, flood, creation, divine human relationships, recur across cultures. They reflect universal human experiences and insights. The weaknesses: it is unfalsifiable. Any evidence can be reinterpreted symbolically to fit the framework. It often imposes later philosophical or mystical systems onto texts that may not have carried those meanings originally. It disconnects the texts from historical and cultural context, treating them as timeless archetypes rather than products of specific societies grappling with specific concerns. Third interpretation: historical documentation. The antediluvian narratives preserve memory, however distorted and mythologized, of real events and real cultural developments. The flood corresponds to the end Pleistocene inundation of the Persian Gulf basin, when rising sea levels drowned lowland settlements between 11,000 and 6,000 years ago. The process was gradual, but included catastrophic storm surges and river floods that forced populations to migrate repeatedly over millennia. The antediluvian cities represent pre-pottery Neolithic or early Neolithic settlements in the now submerged valleys, regional centres with monumental architecture, organised ritual and craft specialisation, contemporary with sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. The impossibly long reign lengths encode not individual lifespans but dynastic periods, cultural memory, or alternative timekeeping systems that do not translate into solar years. When populations migrated to higher ground after the valleys flooded, they established new settlements, Kish, Uruk, Ur, but carried with them cultural memory of the older centres. They preserved the city names, the divine associations, the institutional knowledge. They understood themselves as restoring civilization, not inventing it. The detailed flood survival instructions, boat dimensions, waterproofing, provisions, timing, reflect real knowledge developed by populations facing recurring flood threats. The procedural specificity is not literary invention, but inherited technical knowledge. The me represent knowledge transmission systems, oral tradition, apprenticeship lineages, ritual procedures that preserve civilizational capabilities through the crisis period. This interpretation is heterodox, but not fringe. It takes seriously both the textual claims and the geological evidence. It requires accepting that oral tradition can preserve geographic and cultural information across millennia, a claim supported by some anthropological research but rejected by others. The strengths of this interpretation: it explains the geographic precision and textual consistency without requiring pure invention. It accounts for the sudden appearance of sophisticated Sumerian culture by positing inherited knowledge rather than spontaneous development. It respects the text's own claims about their origins while acknowledging mythological elaboration. It aligns with geological evidence of catastrophic flooding in the region at the end of the Ice Age. The weaknesses: it relies on unprovable assumptions about the capabilities and distribution of pre-pottery Neolithic populations in regions that are now underwater. It risks over-reading the texts, finding historical content where only mythology exists. It can slide into pseudo-archaeology if not carefully constrained, by evidence and methodology. Evaluation. Each interpretation has merit. Each accounts for some aspects of the evidence better than others, and critically, each requires a different standard of evidence and different methodological assumptions. The pure mythology interpretation is conservative and safe. It does not require belief in anything unprovable, but it may be too conservative, dismissing meaningful patterns as coincidence. The encoded wisdom interpretation is rich and generative. It opens deep symbolic and philosophical dimensions, but it is unfalsifiable and often disconnected from historical reality. The historical documentation interpretation is ambitious and engaging. It treats the texts as potentially meaningful records and aligns them with geological evidence, but it is speculative and risks overreach. What we can say with confidence: the end of the Ice Age transformed the Persian Gulf region through catastrophic sea level rise. Pre-pottery Neolithic societies were more sophisticated than previously assumed. Sumerian culture appears fully formed with no clear primitive stage. Sumerian texts insist their civilization was restored after a flood, not created ex nihilo. These facts are compatible with the historical interpretation, but do not require it. They can also be explained by the mythological or symbolic interpretations. The choice of interpretation depends on what you consider more likely: that all the patterns are coincidental, that the texts encode spiritual truths, or that they preserve cultural memory of real events. There is no objective way to adjudicate between these. Each person must weigh the evidence, consider the assumptions, and decide which framework makes the most sense. But make that decision yourself. Do not accept any authority's interpretation, including this one, without examining the evidence directly. The tablets exist, the geological data exists, the archaeological sites exist. Read them, study them, decide for yourself what they mean. Because the question beneath all of this is not were the Sumerians right, but what were they trying to tell us? And the answer to that question depends not on the past, but on the present, on whether we are willing to listen to voices from 4,000 years ago speaking about events 10,000 years ago, on whether we dismiss them as primitive mythology or hear them as witnesses, imperfect witnesses, mythologizing witnesses, but witnesses nonetheless to something that happened in the world before the waters rose. The question in the clay. In the climate-controlled vault, the curator returns CBS 1673 to its archival box. The tablet disappears into the drawer, one fragment among thousands, one voice among millions silenced by time. But the questions it raises do not disappear. They linger in the space between what we know and what we can prove, between the geological record of catastrophic flooding and the textual record of catastrophic memory, between the drowned valleys of the Persian Gulf and the clay tablets insisting that cities existed before the waters came. What were the Anunnaki doing during the Ice Age? If we read the text literally, as fundamentalists of any persuasion might, they were digging canals, building cities, creating humans, and managing the crisis of their creation through increasingly desperate measures, culminating in attempted genocide via flood. If we read the text mythologically, as mainstream scholarship does, the Anunnaki are theological constructs representing cosmic forces, divine attributes, or social institutions. They did nothing during the Ice Age because they never existed except as ideas. If we read the texts as encoded memory, distorted, mythologized, but rooted in something real, then the Anunnaki represents something else. Perhaps earlier populations, perhaps specialized groups within those populations, priests, engineers, astronomers, rulers, perhaps the institutional structures themselves, temples, labor guilds, knowledge transmission systems. And what they were doing was exactly what the texts describe. Once you strip away the divine actors, organising large-scale labour for infrastructure projects, managing water resources, developing survival protocols for catastrophic flooding, preserving knowledge through crisis periods, rebuilding after disasters. This is not ancient aliens. This is ancient humans, doing what humans do when faced with environmental catastrophe. Adapting, organising, remembering, preserving what can be preserved, and rebuilding what cannot. The Ice Age ended, the seas rose, populations migrated, and some of them, the ones who settled in southern Mesopotamia and became the Sumerians, remembered where they came from. They remembered the cities in the valleys. They remembered the flood that drowned them. They remembered that their civilization was older than its current form suggested. And they wrote it down, in Sumerian first, then in Akkadian, then in later Babylonian and Assyrian versions. They copied and recopied the tablets across 3,000 years, preserving the narratives that preserved the memory. Not perfectly. The reign lengths are impossible, the gods are mythological, the details have been elaborated, theologized, reshaped by countless generations of scribes and storytellers. But perhaps, just perhaps, beneath all that elaboration, there is a core, a kernel of historical memory, a witness to something that actually happened in the valleys, now submerged beneath the Persian Gulf. Or perhaps not. Perhaps it is all mythology, beautiful and meaningful in its own right, but disconnected from historical reality. Perhaps the patterns that seem to align with geology are coincidence. Perhaps the Sumerians invented their antediluvian cities with no memory of anything real, and we are simply finding what we want to find in the texts. There is no way to prove it either way, not without underwater archaeology in the Gulf, which has barely begun and may never be comprehensive, not without time travel, not without a signed statement from a Sumerian scribe explaining exactly what sources he drew on when he composed the King List. What we have are the tablets, the clay, the wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft material 4,000 years ago by someone who believed they were recording truth. And we have a choice: to dismiss them as primitive superstition, to decode them as mystical wisdom, or to read them as imperfect but potentially meaningful records of human experience during the greatest climate catastrophe in recent history. Each choice has consequences. Dismiss them, and we may lose information that could enrich our understanding of human cultural development. Decode them esoterically, and we risk disconnecting from historical reality entirely. Read them as history, and we risk over-interpreting fragmentary and ambiguous evidence. But perhaps the choice is not binary. Perhaps we can hold multiple interpretations simultaneously. Mythology and memory, fiction and fragment, theology and testimony. The Sumerians did this. They treated their flood narratives as sacred truth, theologically meaningful, while also treating them as historical truth, something that actually happened. They did not see contradiction between these modes. The story was both a teaching about divine justice and a record of ancestral experience. Maybe that's the model we should follow. Not choosing between mythology and history, but recognizing that ancient peoples used narrative to encode multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. The flood myths are theology, and they are also memory, and they are also wisdom about survival, continuity, resilience. The antediluvian kings are mythology, and they are also chronology, and they are also cultural memory of leadership structures older than writing. The Anunnaki are gods, and they are also ancestors, and they are also the institutions and knowledge systems that survived the transition from one world to another. All of these can be true simultaneously. So what were the Anunnaki doing during the Ice Age? They were doing what you are doing right now. Listening, remembering, preserving, passing down. They were surviving. And because they survived, because they preserved their knowledge through the catastrophe, because they carried their cultural memory from the drowned valleys to the highlands, because they rebuilt their cities and restored their institutions, we exist, not biologically descended from them necessarily, but culturally descended, inheriting a civilization that traces its roots through many transformations back to those first urban centres in Mesopotamia, back through Sumerian to older traditions, back through the flood to the world before. Whether that world was as sophisticated as the text suggests, we cannot know, but it was real. People lived there, they built, they organised, they developed knowledge, they faced catastrophe, and some of them survived. That survival is the hinge on which everything turns. That moment when Ziusudra opens the hatch and sees the sun, when Atrahasis descends from the mountains and offers sacrifice, when Utnapishtim sends out the raven and it does not return. That moment when the crisis ends and the work of rebuilding begins. We are the result of that rebuilding, distant, transformed, mediated through 400 generations and 10,000 years, but connected. The tablets say so, the clay says so, the weight of memory, pressed into earth and baked into permanence, says so. And whether you believe them or not, whether you interpret them as history or mythology or wisdom, they have survived. The knowledge has survived. The story has survived. Just as the Anunnaki, or the humans who became mythologized as Anunnaki, or the institutions that bore that name, survived the Ice Age by doing exactly what the texts describe: preserving knowledge, building boats, carrying seeds, teaching crafts, remembering cities, restoring kingship, surviving. Let that thought carry you now, gently, into sleep. Let the weight of deep time settle around you like water, like clay, like the quiet persistence of memory encoded in tablets that have outlasted empires. The Anunnaki, whatever they were, did their work. And because they did, the story continues. Through you, through everyone who has ever wondered what lies beneath the Persian Gulf, what truths hide in ancient myths, what our ancestors were trying to tell us across the vast silence of prehistory. The question remains open, as it should, as it must, because some questions are not meant to be answered, but to be carried forward, like seeds in a boat, like me in a vessel, like knowledge through catastrophe, into the world that comes after. If this resonated with you, if the tablets spoke and you heard something in their silence, then the transmission continues. And somewhere, 4,000 years ago, a scribe in Nippur sets down his stylus, satisfied that the record is complete. The rest is up to you.